Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite is professor of theology at Chicago Theological Seminary and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She was president of Chicago Theological Seminary between 1998 and 2008, and she is the author of a wide range of books on ethics, global issues, and biblical studies. A weekly columnist for the Washington Post on faith, she has also launched her own blog. Our commentator today is Jason C. Bivins. He's an associate professor of religious studies at North Carolina State University. His most recent book is The Religion of Fear, and he is currently writing about jazz and American religion and about the rhetorics of bigotry and victimization in conservative Christian politics since the 1960s. So we'll begin with our first panelist.
Hi, everybody. This is gonna be a fun session. I don't know how many people have started off their sessions at this particular convention saying that, but we've got a lot of interesting things to talk about. I would first like to say that it was in the program that my co-moderator, John Meacham, would be here with me. And sadly, John, who was the editor of Newsweek, I think you know, was sold by the Washington Post, and John has left Newsweek and gone to Random House, and so unfortunately he is no longer going to be the co-moderator, so I'm it. So I will be representing On Faith. And I know that they wanted me to start out a little bit talking about how On Faith got started. You heard a little bit about it, but I grew up an atheist. My father was Episcopalian and my mother was a Presbyterian, and we were Army brats. I was an Army brat. We traveled everywhere, so my parents occasionally would send us to Sunday school, but when my father liberated Dachau in World War II, the German concentration camp, and he had his staff photographer take all of these photographs of the bodies lying around Dachau, and he had a scrapbook. And I remember when he came back from World War II, I was like 4 or 5, and I remember looking at this scrapbook, having said my prayers dutifully every single night of my life, and thought, there's no God. I don't believe in God, and I told my parents that I didn't believe in God. And it was a bone of contention with them really until the day my father died. He still talked about my being an atheist on his deathbed. But the fact was that it didn't make any sense to me, and I was very angry about religion, and particularly about organized religion. But I was also fascinated by it. I mean, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how anybody who was intelligent could believe in God, given the horrors and the atrocities and the violence in the world. A lot of it done in the name of religion. But I just had so many people who I thought were brilliant and who were people I respected, who were people of faith, different kinds of faith. And because I traveled around the world, I was exposed to a lot of different people of different faith, and so I didn't have any particular prejudice about one faith or another. It was just I didn't understand it at all. But as a journalist, it became clear to me that this was a story, particularly after 9/11, that we were not covering the story. This was a story about religion. And newspapers just didn't have it. We had 1 or 2 religion reporters in the Washington Post. They wrote for the Metro section. They were always sort of played on the inside. We had a page in the Metro section called Religion, 1 page on Saturday. And I kept going to the editor and saying, you know, we're not covering religion. This is a big story. And particularly if you're interested in politics or or foreign policy, but if you're interested in anything, religion is about everything. And I just couldn't get, I wrote memo after memo after memo, and I couldn't get anybody interested in it. And so finally one day I was having lunch with the owner of the Washington Post, Don Graham, and I said, Don, I'm so frustrated. There is this huge story and we're not covering it. As journalists, we need to be on top of this story because it's going to have a huge influence in our lives, much more so in the future than even now. And he said, well, why don't you do a website, a religion website? And I said, I don't know anything about religion, and I don't know anything about the internet. And he said, in effect, well, nobody's perfect. You go ahead and do it. So I called up John Meacham, who went to Yale Divinity School, is a religion scholar, had written a book on religion and sort of separation of church and state, the American gospel. And I said, and John, Newsweek at the Washington Post owned Newsweek at the time, and he was a close friend. And I said, will you do this with me? Will you be my co-moderator, because I have no standing in the world of religion, and if I just started this myself, people would die laughing. And John, we had a long 3-hour lunch one day, and John talked me out of being an atheist. He said, being an atheist is a negative thing, and you're not a negative person. You don't want to be against something. And the other thing is that you know absolutely nothing about religion. And so how can you be against something you don't understand and you don't know anything about? And those two arguments really turned me around. I said, okay, I'm going to start reading. And he gave me a long list of books to read, which I did. And the more I read, the more fascinated I got with the subject of religion. So when I decided to start this, I thought, well, the best thing to do is to get a distinguished panel of religion scholars and theologians and thinkers, and then ask them a question every week and get them to respond to the question. And so I happen to know personally Martin Marty from Chicago and Karen Armstrong, who were friends. Martin Marty had actually been my brother's thesis advisor when he got his PhD in religion at the University of Chicago. And Karen I had known for a long time, and I knew Elaine Pagels, and I knew Bishop Tutu, and I thought, well, that's a pretty good start. So I called the four of them up, and I said, will you be on my panel? And they said, yes. And after that, I would call people, and I'd say, will you be on my panel? Of course, we have Martin Marty, Karen Armstrong, Bishop Tutu, Elaine Pagels, and everybody was sort of dying to be on it. And so we started out with a lively discussion every week, panel discussion, and then we started getting people to do guest voices, which is sort of like a column. And then we started, I started doing a video interview once a week called Divine Impulses, or once every 2 weeks, where I would talk to people about their faith or lack of faith. And one of the things that was the most important to me was to get the most varied possible views of religion that we could. So we have Catholics, and we have Jews, and we have Episcopalians and Protestants of all faiths. We have evangelicals, we have Hindus, we have Buddhists, we have Wiccans, we have Quakers. We have every possible point of view you could have on the panel, and we welcome all points of view. And the idea for me was, especially since I was in this period of learning about religion, was that what I began to realize after I started reading about religion was how really stupid I was, and how uneducated I was, and how little I knew. And of course, the more I read, I'm now, this is as tomorrow, November, will be November, the 4th year anniversary of On Faith. And I probably feel more humble now about how little I know than I ever did before, because, as you all probably know, the more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. But it became clear to me that what was going on in this country and around the world was that people didn't understand religion. They didn't even understand their own religions. And so if they weren't going to understand their own religions, they needed to first learn about that, but then learn about other people's points of view. And one of the things that's been so satisfying to me is when we get all of these voices, and somebody will write a column and then somebody will write something and disagree with it, we seek out people of all different opinions on any subject that we usually will get guest voices, people to write on a subject that we've asked the panel that week. But I remember Susan Thistlethwaite saying once that, you know, she had begun, with T.D. Jakes was on our panel, and she had begun to read T.D. Jakes and sort of said, oh, really? I didn't know that he thought that way. And that's happened with so many people who read on faith and say, oh my gosh, I didn't know that, or I didn't understand that, or that was a point of view that I had never, sort of really taken into account. And so my vision for this was really education and knowledge, and the idea of being pluralistic, to look at every faith. And you know, in a way, I was telling Susan at dinner last night, it's been a really interesting experience for me, because having been an atheist, I came at it, I sort of backed into it. I backed into it because I was a journalist and I felt that we needed to report more about what was going on in religion. But also, as a person, I backed into it with no expectations. I didn't believe in God. And so when something happened that I felt was suddenly, and I realized, having done the reading I did, that I felt was magical or sacred or transcendent, it was such a happy surprise. I didn't have the struggle that so many of my friends who are religious have, of trying to reach out and find God when they are in despair and God has deserted them. I mean, Mother Teresa's, I guess, the perfect example of that. So for me, it's been nothing but a positive experience, and the most exciting thing that I have ever done in my entire life. I learn, I can't wait to get up in the morning. I can't wait to go to bed at night. I mean, well, that's true too. Well, when I get to bed, I always read, you know, and I've got all these things, you know, my friends write all these books, and yet I've got a pile of religion books, and I can't stop reading about it. Everything, every aspect of it, every point of view just fascinates me. To think that over 95% of the people in the world are people of some kind of faith. It motivates them. What is this? What is the meaning of this? Why are we here? What is, you know, man's search for meaning? I don't think that there is a more compelling subject in the entire world. To me, it is constantly fascinating. And when I was talking about Washington, it was a taboo subject. Religion and politics, in the old days anyway, even though people were religious, they would never talk about it. And when they went out to run for office, they would be Bible thumping and Jesus and God, and, you know, because of course this is a Christian country, as we all know. You have to, you know, you have to appeal to the Christian majority if you want to get elected president or Congress or Senate. And everybody in Washington would kind of pretend not to notice. You know, that was something that they had to do out there to get elected. But once you came to Washington, you never talked about it. And I remember a Washington hostess, when I was doing a story about religion in Washington, and she said, my dear, one never discusses religion in Washington. But the thing that's been so interesting to me, actually there was a Episcopal priest who was a friend of mine who said that every time he went to a party with his collar on, nobody would talk to him, and he'd end up in the corner standing by himself. And so one night he decided that he would go in civilian clothes, and he wore a coat and tie. And when someone asked him what he did, he said he was a private detective. And so suddenly he was surrounded by people and had a great time and met a lot of people. But that's the way it was until when I started doing this. You can't believe the number of my friends, a lot of them atheists, who would come over to me at a party and say, we need to talk. And I would be in the corner with them, and they would start talking about their life and their search for meaning, and, you know, their lack of belief, or their struggle with belief, or their beliefs. And it's just, for me, it's been so interesting. I remember, I think Welton Gaddy, you probably all know who Welton Gaddy is, said, And he's got this real Southern accent, and he said he was having lunch with his friend in California, and she said, I don't know what this is all about. I don't see how you can be interested in religion. You know, I mean, what is it? And Welton said, well, are you interested in politics? And she said, yes. Are you interested in foreign policy? Yes. Are you interested in gay rights, marriage, and don't ask, don't tell? Yes. Are you interested in abortion? Yes. Interested in the environment? Yes. Are you interested in immigration? Yes. He said, honey, you're interested in religion. And the fact is that it has to do with everything. I mean, we can take any story that's breaking news in Washington, at the Washington Post, and we can turn it into something about religion, because it always has to do, there's always something that has some sort of an angle. And it doesn't necessarily have to be religious. It could be spiritual, it could be moral, ethical, it's about values. That's what we do. And we want to explore all of this, because what we're doing is writing about the human condition. And the thing that's been so great is that On Faith has become enormously successful against all the odds. And, you know, all my friends would sort of get my husband aside and say, what is she doing? What is Sally doing? And there's still a lot of people who sort of say, oh, she's doing that religion thing. Meanwhile, that religion thing is taking off. And we are now on almost any given week in the top 10 features on the whole Washington Post website. Sometimes we're number one. The video interviews I do have been number one. Recently, in the last few weeks, number one. We are getting a huge amount of traffic. And the other thing is that we are beginning to partner with an awful lot of different groups who have come to us. I mean, we are overwhelmed with material. Everybody wants to write for us. People submit articles. Tony Blair, every time Tony Blair comes to Washington, he wants to do a video interview. If he has something he wants to say, he calls up, his people do, and say he wants to write a piece for On Faith. You know, we're about to, and now that, you know, BeliefNet has been sold and has basically not the same BeliefNet it was, but somebody who's involved with BeliefNet has come to us and said, we want to try to partner with you. Serene Jones from the Union Theological Seminary has asked to partner with us. The Brookings Institution, the Council on Foreign Relations, military.com, which has 8 million visitors a month. The publishing house Harper San Francisco, which is one of the largest publishing houses of religious books in the world, is now going to do a partner with us, and we're going to be doing a series of e-books with them. The Tony Blair Foundation has asked to partner with us. I mean, we're just being, happily, we're being overwhelmed. We already partner with Georgetown University and with other organizations in Washington as well. We do a lot of work with the Pew Foundation. So suddenly, just a moment came. Now, I have to say that none of this would have happened without David Waters, who's sitting right there, who 3.5 years ago showed up at the Post and said, was looking for a job, and I met David, and I fell madly in love with him instantly, and we worked together until he had to leave, sadly, in August, and it was one of the great losses of my life. But he's still writing Under God for us, which is a great addition. But what I want to say to you all is this: On Faith is there for you, and it's there for one of the things we really want to do is to reach out to people in colleges and universities and seminaries all over the country. We want to be part of your curriculum. We want you to write for us. We want your students to write for us. We want ideas. We want different perspectives. This is, you know, I really think within the next year, well, on a 5th anniversary, my goal is to double our traffic and to really be the preeminent site for religion in the world. And I don't like to think small. I like to think big. And I hope with your help that you'll be part of this and that we can make it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I won't take too much time, although I love listening to Sally talk. One of the things I miss most about working at the Post is working with Sally. She's always so full of enthusiasm about this side. It just made me want to get up every morning and go to work. You know, she's such a new convert to religion, and you know, the new converts are the most zealous, right? So she's a zealot for On Faith. I love that. I just want to talk to you briefly about how I have decided over the years to cover religion as a journalist. I've been a working journalist for about 30 years, and I emphasize the term working because there are fewer and fewer of us working journalists today than there were many years ago. So I feel privileged and honored to continue to be in this business. But it's a very difficult job to be a journalist and to cover religion for so many reasons. When I first started doing this about 15 to 20 years ago, I had covered politics, I'd covered education, I'd covered legislatures, and those are tough jobs too, but you sort of know what you're doing. You know who you're talking to, you know what you're going after, you have a focal point, you have a building you go to every day, or you have a committee you cover, you have a certain person or a certain group of people who you spend most of your time dealing with, and you have a very easy and simple focal point. You also are dealing with fairly objective things. You know, objectivity is one of the cardinal rules of journalism, and when you're dealing with government operations or economic things or anything like that, objectivity is not that difficult. You're dealing with facts. Well, there's nothing objective really about religion. It's all so subjective. And you really can't go to the source and get confirmation on anything. I've tried, believe me. You can't do it. And there's no focal point. When I started covering religion in Memphis a long time ago, I mean, even in a relatively small place like Memphis, you have 1 million people, so you have about 1 million believers in something. And where do you start? You have 2,000 houses of worship, you have about 10,000 clergy, you have dozens and dozens of different denominations represented, so there's really no place to go every day to try to cover that story. Where do you start? And I was sort of foundering around, you know, trying to figure out where to go and what to do, what to focus on covering religion in Memphis. And I heard this story, and it really helped me out, and it sort of stayed with me through the years. It's a story about a cub reporter for the New York Times many, many, many years ago who was sent out to cover the Johnstown flood. Now, this was back in the days when you sent your stories by telegraph when you were out on the road. And this was a young reporter, and he wanted to do a really great job, and he wanted to impress his editors. Big story. So he thought that he would not just cover this big story as a reporter, but he would try to write it in a way that sort of impressed not only readers, but his bosses. So he did his reporting, and then he went to the telegraph office nearby, and he would send one paragraph at a time when you were writing a story like that. And he sent in his first paragraph, and it said, "Johnstown, PA, amid a flood of biblical proportions, God sat on a hillside, surveying the destruction he had wrought." And he sent that first paragraph in. And a few minutes later, he got a telegraph back from his editor saying, "Forget the flood, interview God." And I thought, well, you know, you can't really interview God, but I'm taking something from that, and I'm trying to find out God's impact on situations. You can cover the impact God makes on our lives and our world. You can write that in an objective way. You can find a focal point by covering the impact God makes in whatever we do, whether it's at the personal level, the community level, the national, international level. God/religion/faith is making an impact every day on just about everything that happens. And that's what I try to cover as a journalist. Now, when I moved to On Faith 4 years ago, it seemed like a natural progression for me, because if there's no better place in the world, and I would include Jerusalem in this, than Washington, D.C. to cover the impact religion makes on our world. And it's not just been since 9/11 that has been true. It's always been true. Maybe we're just more aware of it since 9/11. But we, as Sally said, we can cover religion's impact on the world every day. And through On Faith, through the blog we call On Faith, it's really a multi-purpose website. We can cover religion's impact on every story from every perspective. And that's what I loved most about being the editor of On Faith, and that's what I miss most about it. Sort of sitting at the feet of people like Tony Stevens Arroyo and Sue Thistlethwaite and Mike Kessler, who's here, and Sally, and so many, and John Meacham, so many people who know so much. I felt like I was the world's luckiest student in the world's greatest religion seminar every day. I was learning so much. And I think that's the value of a site like On Faith. That's the value that we bring to readers and to other people. We can give you so many perspectives on the same story, the same issue all at once. And I think there's great value in that. And I think that that's why we do what we do. Thanks.
Afternoon. Good afternoon. That's right. I know, CAAR, you're comatose. All right. When Sally Quinn first asked me to write for On Faith, I almost said no. I thought, why would I want to do that? And the one experience I had had before that was when the pictures of Abu Ghraib first started racing around the world. I had written an editorial for the Chicago Tribune. I had never done such a thing before. But I was so horrified by what was happening. And I wrote an editorial called Can a Nation Lose Its Soul? And I related it actually to torture in Chicago in Area 2, which is, of course, very well known, even internationally, about police torture in Chicago. But even so, this as policy. And they ran it with the picture of the hooded prisoner attached to the wires, which is, of course, such a Christological image. And it went everywhere, because even in print news, then people access it online, and there you go. And I was hearing from people from all parts of the country who emailed me at CTS, and it made me think, who aren't we reaching with progressive view of religion? So I did say yes. And in the early years of On Faith, we were doing a lot of just religious topics, talking about spirituality, talking about our prayer life, talking about God and women. I wrote a column on what I'd learned from my yoga teacher. And these were the kinds of questions early on, but then, I decided to step it up a little bit. And I was sort of learning, and I was learning from David, how to make something have legs. And in this sort of writing, you really got to have the whole story in the headline. And I liken this to trying to write haiku, or trying to, because short doesn't have to mean dumb. I mean, even in the era of Twitter, perhaps even especially in the era of Twitter, it's just short. That doesn't mean it can't be profound. It's hard work. And so I wrote this. This is the first one that I wrote that really, for On Faith, that went and had a ton of comments, but also didn't go viral, but it went around a lot. And it was called Sex and the Single God. And it was a critique of patriarchy and monotheism. And so I went on to realize, and it's a self-taught sort of genre here, that you're just trying to figure it out, because it's not preaching, and it's not academic writing, and it's really not, as you point out, David, it's not journalism. So, what is it? And most people don't read past the first paragraph at most, but you have to try. So between the headline and the first two sentences, that's pretty much all you got to tell people the story. One of the things that I learned a lot from is the people who comment. And this is not elevating. It's not an elevating genre. I was joking around with that there's literally nothing he can say in criticizing the work that I've done here for On Faith that comes anywhere close to what people post. And my adult children all read this, but my second son reads the comments too. And he calls me up and he goes, "Mom, did you see what that guy said?" And I said, "Billy, But I learned from the comments because I'm looking for what hits a nerve. And one of the things that hits a nerve is when I quote the Bible. And I wrote a column called Jesus Said, Watch the Money. And everybody knows a lovely story about the widow's mite, and it's very sweet. And the widow gives, you know, all that she has, and the rich man gives disproportionately. I'm sure those of you who are Christian and have been in Christian churches have heard many, many such sermons. But if you go one verse before that, Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Mark 12:41. Jesus watched the money. And most of the time, if you want to know what's happening in politics and you want to know what's happening in religion, do what Jesus said. Sit down where you can watch the money. And that got a lot of people upset. And then we started in on the year of 2008, and I think we really hit our stride with religion and politics. And I wrote a column called Politics, Where Truth Comes to Die, which was about, you know, your people manufacturing their own facts. But the one that, and I consider this still my best headline ever, my best haiku, was the one I wrote on Sarah Palin, called Hell on Heels. And Palin supporters are enthusiastic. They're extremely enthusiastic people. They shut down, clogged my computer at the seminary, not content merely to post at the Washington Post, but look me up at the seminary and send me. I got a hold of David for about 2 hours. I was going, David, what's happening here? But they just sent me robo-emails, not particularly praising what I thought was an exceptionally good connection between theology and politics. But I learned from that. I learned a lot from that. And very much about how subversive humor in this genre can be. And you know, the humor, it's tough. I mean, the comedy, it's really dicey. But I do find that the capacity to, at what we in a, you know, an academic setting would call critical consciousness, how do we break through the bubble on self-congratulatory religion, self-congratulatory politics, and how do we help people at least get behind that just a little bit? And sometimes comedy can do that. Now we've just had the rally to restore sanity and fear, or the rally to restore and/or fear. And the New York Times wrote, for many who came, the rally was an opportunity to take control of the political narrative, if only for one sunny Saturday afternoon. Participants, overwhelmingly liberal, wore political buttons, waved flags, carried signs, often with funny messages. Now, I thought that in itself was funny on the part of the New York Times, because there is a liberal equals funny. But I think there is a message in this that I have been trying to work out in my own head. And I think the moment when it occurred to me that I was completely changing what I thought about theology based on faith was when I wrote the column Zombie Nation. And basically talking about Paul Krugman's column, All the President's Zombies, and how it could be that, as Krugman wrote, Reaganomics, though dead as a theory, proven not to work, is yet walking around and apparently alive. And I realized that young people, what all the young people and all the zombies, so you see things differently living in this internet religion politics stew. And I ended up writing a book based on what I have come to learn is different about doing theology on the internet and how I think it's changing religion as well as politics. And I wrote this book, Dreaming of Eden, American Religion and Politics in a Wired World. And I don't only think that the internet is an amplification, so it just magnifies good and evil. I actually at least trying to explore the idea that it might be changing the nature of good and evil. I do think that this genre is a good teaching tool. The students are on the internet anyway. They're on the internet while they're supposed to be listening to our lectures, checking their email and so forth. And I have started to use On Faith in my teaching. David allowed me to let my students compete to be published on Faith. And we, in fact, got one student to write about nuclear nonproliferation. They all send in their columns every week, but there was one that you took, and he titled that Ashes to Ashes. It was great. It was really, really well done. So it's a good team, and they were very motivated because they might get published. But shorter headlines, saying the whole thing, painting a word picture, making an emotional connection. Those are the things I've learned for how to write this way. Now, I've had two things go viral. My lawyer called me up and said, you're here on my homepage. And I said, which one was that? And I wrote about Bo the dog. The puppy, Bo the dog. And one of the things that helped it go viral was David put a little picture of Puppy Bo wearing a little lei, that little picture, Puppy Bo. So this post was, isn't it nice to be happy and think about something besides all of our problems as a nation? Happy, happy, puppy, puppy. Another thing I'm happy about are all of these recent decisions about gay marriage. And second paragraph, gay marriage, happy, happy. And then I had a little critical thing about still LGBT Americans having to fight for their equal civil rights, and then puppy, puppy, puppy. So it was effectively a rhetorical Twinkie, right? So it was a Twinkie with yogurt in the middle, though. And so I had puppy, puppy, and who doesn't like a story about a puppy? And then gay marriage, gay marriage, gay marriage, but making an emotional connection for people. Puppies, really, really cute. Gay marriage, really, really good. And that, everywhere. And so I thought, and I have some ethical problems with this, that, it's like trying to get your children to eat broccoli, so you put a cheese sauce on it. And they say, well, it's not really broccoli, it's cheese. You're going to like it. It's like nachos with cheese. But at the end of the day, there's cholesterol in the cheese. So, maybe we'll talk about this, because you get into areas where you go, you know how to do that, but are you willing to actually go there all the time? Not always. And then the other one that went viral was the Walmart employee who was killed by the shoppers on Black Friday. And he was literally trampled to death. And they continued to walk over him to get to the flat screen TVs that were on sale. Mark Silk said yesterday, the line here at the AAR, the line between academic religion and the media has blurred. And we are now, as academics, and I think this is my takeaway for you at this point, we are now, or can be, producers of the media. It's not hard. You can do this. You're sitting there, Mark. And it was, smart, as usual, Mark. We can do this. And I actually believe we must do it. It's not just call Martin Marty anymore, though, it's hard to go wrong with calling Martin Marty. But what does it mean to you that you are, and many of you I recognize sitting here are producers in the news media, or that potentially you can be? Thank you.
This will not be a fun comment. I'm always overwhelmed by the magic of the iPod Shuffle and its ability to deliver up appropriate warnings at seemingly inopportune moments. So, as I was reading over my notes this morning, dialing in the way that an NFL player conducts a pregame ritual, the song that came up and stopped me in my rereading was "Problem Child" by AC/DC. And I paused, unsure of myself. But nonetheless, I'll dive in. I'd like to note, first of all, that it's a really nice opportunity to be here to participate in this rich session and to be privileged to make some observations about these incredible and provocative observations, and perhaps most of all to do so as part of a focus on my beloved hometown newspaper, which I still read daily online, so shout out, as it were. In fact, just this morning, as I was reading On Faith online, I read a series of post-Colbert Stewart comments from, among others, Deepak Chopra, comments which suggested we needed more faith and less faith and better faith in public life, all in the context of a collective public satire. And I thought to myself, what a dazzling opportunity for reflection on the topsy-turvy looking glass world in which we all live and read and digitize our identities. So in thinking about the value of online, quote, discussions of political public religions in the United States and about the role played by blogs generally and this blog in particular, I thought I would frame my remarks in a way that doesn't necessarily privilege the viewpoint of the professoriate, but given that we are at an academic meeting and I am charged with responding, I thought that I would draw on some of my own orientations as a writer about political religions in the United States and try to raise some larger, perhaps quasi-theoretical questions about not only these kinds of forums as objects of study, but about the way we think about them. And yeah, maybe how we participate in them as well. So I want to use the specific example of On Faith to reflect more broadly on the ubiquity of religion blogs and religion as a subject of increasing interest, and also to reflect on what these forums signify to us. So I want to consider, as I mentioned, blogs as object of study, blogs as, picking up on some of Susan's comments, a particular kind of discursive format, but most of my remarks will focus on blogs in their context. And by this I mean both the context in which they emerge, politically, historically, culturally, but also the sense in which these kinds of exchanges can be seen as an index of our political health, a pulse to be taken. Now, it took me, in ways that all of the speakers have, in a sense, already addressed, it took me a long time to start reading blogs. And this is something that I continue to do very selectively. Rightly or wrongly, my impression 10 years ago, or whenever I first formed an impression of blogs, my impression of them was as kind of public confessionals, digital venting, sort of the most recent equivalent of the guy who stands on a street corner and hands out his open letter to President Obama or something like this. Always suspicious of the wearisome promises of digital democracy, I grew to understand how personal blogs could facilitate some kind of self-determination, catharsis, or dare we dream, even poesis. But what concerned and puzzled me about non-personal blogs during a period where I was growing concerned about a whole lot of things around me was the complex transformation of authorial, perhaps even academic authority, as rants and screeds and manifestos and bloviations multiplied, blended, recirculated in a context of ongoing evaporation and emergence. But of course, I developed my thinking yet again. And thinking my way to On Faith, we in this room know that there is nothing more commonplace in the United States than debates over the merits of public religion. But how do such debates, and even generally felt interest in religions with all the complicated and elusive motivations that interest might entail, how do these things change with digital mediation and blogging? Do we ask new questions? Does a new grammar characterize the discourse? Are new people participating? Does the discourse have a longer resonance? Now, as I mentioned, American interest in our religions has been ongoing. A self-consciousness or self-awareness that has at times bordered on national solipsism. So obsessed have we regularly been with, depending on your narrative, that lively experiment of religious pluralism or the ongoing sacred history begun providentially at Plymouth. Yet On Faith, along with multiple related expressions, has emerged in an especially charged religio-political moment for Americans. Our hunger for content, a term whose fantastical emptiness has always amused me, our hunger for content over the last decade has grown amidst the post-9/11 hue and cry about religious violence and spectacles of national righteousness, and in many ways it has also grown in response to two very differently polarizing presidents. Yet while conservatives still define the discourse about religion in public life in many ways, it seems to me worth considering that one of the major shaping factors in the popularity of blogs generally, and religion blogs specifically, is a distrust of nearly all institutions, liberal media, big government, pinhead professors, you name it. So outside of these traditional authorities, each of us then assembles our favorites, both solitary and shared. And aside from those of us in this room who fuss about religion in contexts like these, we seek out and absorb an impossible amount of text, fueled either by an earnestness that dreams of religious group hugs or by outrages. I wonder then, to what extent do even superbly crafted forums like On Faith, of which I am actually a fan, including specifically a fan of Susan's writing, to what extent are even these forums positioned simply as resources for very different kinds of citizens who pursue data mining in targeted ways that endlessly confirm the projects of the self, and ironically, given how great the volume of information surrounding us, simply shield and seal off complexity or nuance? These are among the contextual factors shaping these forums. And together, they invite us to consider our own subject position as journalist, as academic, as engaged reader, as vessel of outrage. But they also ask us to reconsider our relationship to audience. So here I speak specifically as an academic. Now, we used to be, and I sort of narrated my own early suspicion, we used to be, and many still are, highly resistant to these kinds of media, perhaps because we're suspicious of popularizers, which is always a secret envy, of course. Perhaps because we're distrustful of what seems overly simplified. But as Susan and Stuart Hoover and others have noted elsewhere, something changes in media which are rapid and responsive, engaged and emphatic. The temperate face of the blog also masks the excited discourses attracted to it and which the blog energizes, providing grist for every mill, whether snarky or earnest, theocentric or phobic. The discourses sustain themselves, promising outrages and chuckles and maybe occasionally an insight, demanding our continual attention like a cable news ticker into and onto which we can upload our emotional intensities, which register our most authentic experience in and of these media. This riot of opinion, which masks as participation and dwells in a pool of data available to anyone connected, is what complicates scholarly relations with audiences, raising questions about the vitality of conventional authorial obligations, about decisions to address the mythical entity known as the broader public, and about obligations to respond to or enter into public debates. Now, one response is simply to engage in a kind of revivified version of Straussianism in an attempt to justify our institutional privilege. And this usually takes the form of assertions that we scholars have access to a depth dimension, the really real of complexity and nuance, the true story behind what is vomited into Wikipedia and so forth. But I raise these kinds of questions not to assert that as scholars of religion we need to contest or reject admirable forums like On Faith, nor that we should necessarily start our own blogs. This is an effort with risks and opportunities recently very, very well described by Ed Blum. But as we seek to clarify our relations to various non-academic publics, or perhaps even to different academic publics, we must think not only of the possibilities of remaking and maintaining a critical engagement with public life, but also about the institutions which produce and sustain our goals and values. the manner in which we formulate and articulate them, and the degree to which they may serve us and only us. By this, I mean that aside from the fact that we mostly come to meetings like this and talk to each other in little rooms, or a slightly bigger room in this case, despite the fact that we often say the things that are simply expected of us, we often justify our purposes, particularly those of us who write about public life, by suggesting, perhaps this is a conceit, that we are contributing to tolerance, harmony, and understanding. Well, I think it's worth pointing out that the scholar's noblesse oblige often escapes our hermeneutic of suspicion here. I raise this point because whether we engage in or withdraw from, support or turn away from places like On Faith, our tribe often expends much of its energy on the politics of representation and the piling on of complexity and nuance, as if the cake of public life must be frosted with our methodological anxiety. Now, I don't think this is inappropriate or ill-intentioned or anything of the sort. I don't think that we must necessarily simply rush into public life and hurl lightning bolts of clarity, assuming that we think we have one in our quiver. But as I've noted with regard to the context of the blog's very emergence, our discourses about religion seem to hover somewhere above the ground on which, perhaps the data smog in which, quote, religion as a construct eludes both a certain reportorial mode and an academic one. So what we would like to believe is that the emergence of such blogs can give voice to truths too seldom audible in the anarchic world open to our screens. That while conventional print and TV journalism may be too blunt or too beholden to interest to deliver readers the content that will clarify, the minutiae that will give shape to uninformed abstractions, perhaps these new spaces will. We want our subject to matter, to receive attention that on some level will work with Pew surveys and special reports to convince our deans to keep our departments afloat and at least partly funded. And we count it as undeniable that interest in religion is a good thing because maybe, just maybe, if more people read On Faith, fewer of them will drool Islamophobia or something like that. Now, this is the model driving various self-presentations in our field and which the field shows non-specialist. The underlying idea is one of nebulous tolerance, abstract celebration of manyness, where the acquisition of knowledge serves as recipe for social order and good citizenship. And this is the orientation to religion and public life laudably embraced by On Faith and its kin. Yet, I am suggesting, qua problem child, in spaces like these, regardless of the well-meaning intentions of architects and contributors, perhaps religion simply becomes yet another convenient rhetorical snag on which our concerns are pinned, or a reflective surface that continually assures us that we are right. So perhaps the trope at work here is not so much ignorance as intransigence. Now, I know full well that many of the things that pop up on blogs such as these are newsworthy, very, very newsworthy items, Tea Party reports, Christine O'Donnell drive-bys, a column from Jim Wallace. These are valuable things, but what I'm suggesting is we ask ourselves, is this what is truly significant? Is it the interest that the blog marks, in other words? I think of a critical tradition about which John Caputo has written elsewhere, which stretches at least from early Heidegger through Deleuze and Guattari through Alain Badiou, the latter of whom says, critical theory has a task to release the event. Now, I would never mistake a blog for critical theory, nor should that necessarily be the aspiration of bloggers. But I wonder, do spaces like these release the events of a Tea Party, a town hall meeting, a Christine O'Donnell constitutional gaffe, or do they in fact bury them in text, trap them in text? And I'm thinking, picking up again on Susan's comments, I'm thinking increasingly about how the comment sections signify these endless spaces of rage, disagreement, and of course, abundant citation. If you really would like to understand, please read my blog. Their bottomless depths might not necessarily seem to epitomize the developments in communication represented by On Faith, but while the main presentation captures Americans' interest in this subject and the subject's importance, the backstage story seems to capture the tenor of public discourse. And perhaps it is this tone, this mode of circulation or emotional intensity that is as compelling a subject of interest as the blog's subjects themselves. So we might ask ourselves to what extent the various conversations enabled here being a kind of loose signifier, those rooted in the pluralist narrative of tolerance, those rooted in academic narratives of authority, those rooted in righteous rage of anti-clerical or theocentric citizens alike, do these narratives on some level simply refer back to themselves, endlessly looping and looping? Do they not function somehow to confirm our mutual otherness, to provide the raw material and decontextualized data, discourse shorn of accountability, or those spectacles that warn and display? Do they simply give us materials for explaining ourselves to ourselves? That is, when we're confronted with the frank emptiness of our utopic leanings, the post-1989 triumph of liberalism, digital democracy, and so forth, these displays of outrage enable us to look away from our emptiness and assign to our feelings instead an explanation of exteriorized wrongdoing. This is Zizek's external ideological ritual, culminating in what he elsewhere calls interpassivity. And this all takes place in a context where what the political theorist Sheldon Wolin would describe as demotic moments, Tea Party being a primary example thereof, do not necessarily seek greater participation or anything of the like, nor can they be understood simply as the recrudescence of populist rage with all of the religio-racial baggage that might bring. Rather, they exemplify, I suggest, a moment of managed democracy of which our digital dependencies are a part, where we roil amid inescapable public chatter, information flows, voyeurism. So the loud and the shocking are rewarded by gaining attention. What is repeated and circulated acquires the name of truth, around which we fashion our individualities, shorn of hackneyed notions like evidence or verification, suasion or authority, accountability or respect. To make these observations, I hope it is clear, is not to announce some curmudgeonly wish for a time of quiet remove from these technologies, nor to throw up my hands and give in to what the novelist J.M. Coetzee calls inner emigration. I hope that it is to name things clearly in the spirit of a different understanding of politics, one that is not given but revisable, and where revisable means something more than simply tailoring them again and again to our own self-interest and self-image. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panelists for keeping their remarks brief, so that means that we have a half an hour, a little short of a half an hour, for questions and answers. What I'd like you to do is to think carefully about your question or comment so that you make it snappy and brief. If it's not snappy and brief, I might wave at you and I might fall asleep or otherwise indicate that we need to get moving. If you also would address perhaps your question or comments to one of the panelists, then they can come up and respond. This session is being taped, and I think the media folks would appreciate it if the panelists would speak here at the podium as opposed to speaking at their places. So again, if you'll keep your questions and comments brief, if you would say them loudly so they could be heard, and also panelists, if you might briefly repeat the question so that the people who are, so the recordings will understand what the question is. In the front row here, please. I think standing would be a grand idea. Loud, loud.
There's actually a microphone coming.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. So for Ms. Quinn, I read On Faith as well, and one of the things I very much like about it is that you do have atheist bloggers. And so I was wondering, you said you now see atheism as a negative thing, or John Meacham convinced you it's a negative thing. So do you see those bloggers as negative? Do you see that atheism as a negative phenomenon? Sorry about that.
Well, let me clarify a little bit when John said to me that being an atheist is a negative thing, you don't want to define yourself by what you're against. You want to define yourself by what you're for. However, I don't, we have Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Susan Jacoby are all atheist bloggers for us. They're all friends of mine. Christopher has been a friend of mine for almost 40 years. And I think that they're all really smart. And I think that they come at religion in a way that I used to come at it, but don't come at it anymore. You know, when they talk about religion, and I've interviewed every one of them. I did a video interview with Christopher about 6 weeks ago. That was the #1 video, by the way. The interesting thing is that we have a huge number of atheists and humanists and secularists, agnostics, who come to the site. And when I interviewed Christopher, then I interviewed Richard Dawkins the next week, and then I interviewed Sam Harris the next week. I said, I've got to get some evangelicals in here quickly, because they were just back. They just all happened to be in town at the same time. They never say anything that I can contest. They never say, and that that when they're giving facts, they say this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and they're right about it. It's the difference between faith and reason, and they exclude faith from their viewpoint. And they're all very different, by the way. I mean, Dawkins is much more of a scientist. Christopher is Christopher is a sort of an intellectual, and he's a character, and he's a fantastic sort of personality. Sam is much quieter, more, I didn't know this until I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago, that he took 2 years and went to India and lived in an ashram and meditated for 18 hours a day. And he still meditates every day now. So I respect them enormously for their points of view and for their embrace of the rational and reason. And I don't see them, what I see that they're negative about, and what I was and still am negative about, is so many of the evils that are committed in the name of religion and organized religion. What goes wrong in organized religion, and what goes wrong when people who are religious claim to have the final word. I mean, I went to the rally yesterday on the mall, and there were some signs. I was writing down the religious signs, and one of them said, "God hates rallies," and another one said, "God hates signs." And a couple of weeks, when Glenn Beck did his rally, he was quoted as saying, I really wasn't going to do this rally, and then God hit me over the head with a bag, and I had to do it. And so I wrote about it, and I said, I really wasn't going to write this column, but God hit me over with the head with a bag, and so I had to do it. When people claim to have the Word of God, they lose me right away. I always liken it to the football game at the half, where both, the Redskins and the Cowboys go into the locker room, and they're both praying to win. And you have this vision of God sitting up there sort of saying, am I going to go with the Skins, or am I going to go with the Cowboys today? I don't know. That kind of intercessionary prayer, and the idea that, when anybody says, Susan and I were talking about this last night, the minute that somebody says God knows, God wants, God believes, God thinks, the first thing you say is, well, how do you know? My favorite bumper sticker in the entire world was one that I nearly wrecked the car when I saw it. It said, "I don't know, and you don't either." So I think that the rage, the rage or the anger or the negativity that comes from the atheists who are blogging is more toward people who are unreceptive and refuse to acknowledge that there is a possibility that there is no God, and that they will try to convert other people to their points of view. This is what's so scary to me about this, where we seem to be easing into with this Tea Party movement, that the whole notion that separation of church doesn't exist. I mean, even Christine O'Donnell, who, I love her so much. I'm just sick she's going to lose because we get so many hits every time we write about her. But anyway, she said separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. Well, those words aren't, but the idea is. And so when people start actually talking about separation of church and state as something that doesn't exist, I find that very scary. So to answer your question, sometimes I feel that my atheist friends are completely excluding the possibility of God or excluding the possibility of faith, and oftentimes will ridicule it. I don't feel that way, but I do respect their view about reason and fact.
This is for Jason. I'm thinking about Benjamin's art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and I think you hinted at this, but I wonder if you could address what religion might look like in the age of digital reproduction.
I hate you for this question, Sean, first of all. I'm going to delay my answer by pointing out that on some level, this is something you all need to know, but on some level, perhaps the greatest sign from yesterday's rally was the God hates nags sign. With regard to, right, it's good. With regard to the distinction between mechanical reproduction and digital reproduction, I would say that we're clearly talking about the transition from a kind of classically materialist, not just sort of institutional context, but imaginary, to one in which not only are we clearly in a different kind of political economico context, but the availability of emotional intensities and so forth is what I think is really changing. Now, to what extent, I take this to be the force of your question, to what extent is this actually going to lead to a change in religions themselves? I actually have no particular idea about how the content of traditions will change, about how people will interact with one another differently in, for example, the ritual space. But I think the ways in which religion is conceptualized, to wax a quasi-reductionist for a moment, the needs religions will suggest it can address with and for practitioners will be articulated differently. But I think the specific changes I can envision have, and this is to wax anti-reductionist, have to do exclusively with religions as political forces. I wouldn't want to generalize my observations beyond the political sphere such as it is. So I hope that's not too lame an answer.
Another question, and we were on this side, trying to spend equal time.
Okay. I was curious. I spend a lot of time studying new religious movements, so-called cults, and I was wondering, where do you see the media portraying these? Because, I mean, like Islam, you'll have something where it's like, these guys are okay, but there are some crazies out there, whereas with new religions / cults, whatever you want to call them, there's almost this emphasis on bad, bad, bad. So where do you see the media needs to change on that, or if it needs to change at all?
Well, I think all of us should answer that question, but a friend of mine, Steve Prothero, who teaches at BU, has a course, and every year he asks his students to create a new religion. And he said they come up with the most amazing religions that you could ever, and rituals and ceremonies and all that is completely original and creative. So the idea of what happens when you have a new religion, it's very dicey to say, because people will now say, well, they talk about religion as the Abrahamic faith. So you've got Christianity and Judaism and Islam. but we can't even talk about the Abrahamic faiths anymore in this country because we have so many other faiths as well. And that's where, when you talk about separation of church and state, that's where it becomes really important, because if somebody says, I believe this and I'm starting a religion and this is what it is, then who's to say that they're not right, that they don't have the right to have their own religion, to call themselves whatever they want to believe whatever they want, to pray they want, who they want, to whom they want. And so I think as long as, we have representatives, we have Wiccans on the panel, and we have representatives from various faiths. And if we have somebody who is really smart and writes really well and thoughtfully and intelligently, and they call themselves, avatars, then, we'll run what they have to say. We're trying to get all points of view out there, and I think that one of the things that is happening with the internet and also with On Faith, we're trying to be pluralistic, and that means listen to everybody, because there is not one single person in this entire world of 300 billion, how many people there are in the world, who actually believes the same thing and has the same relationship with his or her faith. There's not one. And so who's to say one is right and one is not? Susan?
Yeah, just a word. Thank you. Two things. One, in answer to your question, and I think Sally has actually said it, one of the things this medium depends on is producers. And so, got some good game, write it up, because I think that's how this, it's really not such a top-down notion of power. It's not completely open source, of course, but it is more distributed in terms of power. Could be better. I had a question for Jason. Who adjudicates significance? You said, Of
the subject?
Yes, in terms of the media. You were talking about the adjudication of significance. And one of the things I've learned here is that as an academic, I sort of thought I at least had a large role in adjudicating significance. And I've been, it was just me. But I have learned and been humbled in some ways by what people pick up on as significant.
Absolutely.
And so, I was wanting you to just clarify that comment vis-a-vis your kind of riff critique of what does it actually mean and problematizing.
Yeah, okay. I'd be happy to. I'll be brief as well. We must first define the it, right? So who adjudicates the registration of the significance of religion as an object of study? I think there are all kinds of external modes of signification and tracking and registration and all kinds of things, In the context of today's discussion, I would say page hits and things like that, publication rates, conference sponsorships, and so forth. But in terms of where and why do I find significance in attending to the background discourse, this is a provocation, this is speculation, but as I take sense of, both of my books have focused on cultures of religious discontents, and most recently I have aimed to trace the migration of sentiments and orientations to political life that were once considered to be not just marginal but comical in the 19th century, in the 1960s, the migration of such sentiments to the center of public life, And so it's in this migration, it's in this population, it's in larger resonance of these discourses of rage and terror and so forth that I see the significance, and this is why I've proposed focusing not exclusively but additionally on the background culture. So I hope that's a good answer.
Thank you for a great panel. My question's for Susan. Your story about the responses to one of your pieces crashing the university email sort of gets at my hesitation about getting into the public sphere in this kind of way, which is that I can't keep up with my emails just from on campus and the religious publishers that have started to get my email and apparently share it. I have something like 3,000 unopened emails, back waiting for me when I get back. The thought of 10,000 Palin supporters bombarding me, it seems to me inevitably you're either not taking them seriously and you can't read them all, or else you read them all and you don't get anything else done. What's your solution?
I press delete. I do. And I do it in batches. Seriously.
Um,
You got it. Why do you think I asked? I was looking for help.
I have a question. I think I have a question. And that's about what Sally was talking about before, about the size and the traffic that goes into a website. I wonder if we're going through a stage of development in terms of this blogosphere in which the sheer quantity and the individuality of every speaker now has to be pruned, otherwise it doesn't go there. The question comes in this way. It seems to me that in the area that I've been interested in with the Catholic blogs, there's a group of people that have one guy with a computer who then magnifies stories, and it gets picked up that so-and-so wrote this, and then it becomes a legitimate news story, not because it's true, but because somebody wrote it. Now, I know that's true in the other areas, but I'm specifically looking at that area. So to what degree does a website like On Faith change that dynamic, that size can make a difference?
That is something we struggle with all the time. Who should we give credibility to when we cite them, when we link to them, when we offer them a place on our site? And I think it goes back to the gentleman's question over here about who should we take seriously and who shouldn't we? You know, one thing about the internet is that it has democratized communication, but it's also animized communication. Everything's in pieces now. There are about 100 million blogs out there. So who should we listen to? Well, we sort of use three measurements in journalism world, at least the journalists I'm familiar with, and that is it useful, is it interesting, and is it relevant? Now, snake handlers in East Tennessee might be really interesting, but are they relevant? Probably not. Are they useful? You know, probably not. A Mormon sect, a polygamous Mormon sect, might or might not be interesting to you, but there are times when it's very relevant to what's happening in this country, what's happening with law enforcement or religion at large. A Hindu sect that comes up with a new form of yoga, you know, that might not necessarily be particularly relevant to a lot of people, but it might be useful to a lot of people to find out more about that. So those are the things that we are constantly juggling. But one of the things that we try to do with On Faith, and one of the things that Sally has continued to push, and she's mentioned this here today, is to try to be open to as many voices as possible. And I think that's really important. That's one thing that the net lets us do. We have unlimited space. We have unlimited time. So we have so many more ways that we can communicate with you and allow other people to communicate with each other. And I think that that is ultimately, fundamentally really important in what we do.
Then this is for you, and thanks for the shout out, by the way. You, in a way, responding or asking Jason a question before, raised this issue, or responded, as I would take it, to Jason's kind of suggestion that when academics get into the blogging business, they are bringing forward a kind of hegemonic agenda. But it sounds like what you said was you've been changed into a journalist more than you've sort of imposed your own authority on the blogosphere. And I guess, you know, as somebody who myself have played both sides of the street, that's a question worth exploring a little bit more. I wonder if you would say whether you feel like the ways in which what you do have changed have made you into at least a reasonable facsimile of a professional opinion writer for a mainstream media publication.
I've thought a lot about that, Mark, and I think I'm a blogger. And I had one journalism class in college, and so at least I know not to bury my lead. But this is opinion, but blogging is actually, I am beginning to believe, a different genre. And I'm, you know, old enough that, you know, I'm a full professor, I was president of my seminary, what are they going to do to me, right? So, so I'm also trying to let the medium somewhat be permeable to my theology, how I construct theology. So I'm interested in this. Does hits equal significance? Well, you know, there's some ways to cast that yes, but there are other ways to cast that as like no, that's like hits, you know. And this is, you know, what you were trying to point out. When there's a journalist like David moving all this blogging around, I'm actually more comfortable than I am out in the general blogosphere where, you know, all bets are off. So I would say it's blogging mediated by professional journalism. But this is new. This is new in the history of humanity, and it's like we're sitting here with a printing press and we're going, you think that's going to be significant religiously? Gutenberg? So.
It's now just about 2:30. I'd like to thank you all for coming to this session and have a wonderful rest of your stay in Atlanta. Thank you.
Happy Halloween.